Welcome, one and all, to episode 63 of the Business on the Bloc podcast. This is January 17th, 2024. 63 episodes, guys. And so this week, we're tackling, has the podcast bubble burst? Today, we pull back the curtain on the podcast industry's inflated download numbers. As Apple quietly yanks the automatic downloading, many popular shows are seeing their listenership crash. So this decline is hitting some of the biggest names in the game: New York Times, NPR. We'll get into it. So the question is the entire podcast industry built on a foundation of fudged numbers? Today, we're going to explore this. I'm joined, as always, by my lovely co-host, Michelle Peterson-Clark.
Hi, everyone.
Mike Neubauer, your ops guy.
Good evening.
And I'm Marc Angelos. So we're going to jump right into story number one. This one is coming to us courtesy of Semaphore. I think this is our first entry from Semaphore on this show. The incredible shrinking podcast industry is the piece. And briefly, Apple has quietly stopped automatic podcast downloads for any users who haven't listened to 5 episodes of the show. So this is decimating the official listening numbers for many of the biggest podcasts out there. Some shows have seen their download numbers cut by as much as 40%. And ironically, it tends to be in the large media companies' podcasts. So you can read the article at your leisure, but we're pairing that with an article also coming out of TechCrunch, courtesy of Michelle. Everything you know about the podcast industry is a lie, is the headline. This is going back a few weeks. In 2021, with venture capital flowing, Spotify said it wanted to become the TikTok of audio. But at the end of 2023, that had 3 rounds of layoffs. So I'll spare you the gory details. We all know this, but the tech industry in general has had a massive number of layoffs and has hit Spotify fairly hard, which they are the bellwether for the podcasting industry. So I guess I'm trying to take a pick of who's going to be the person who'll kick off our commentary here. Mike, you want to give us some thoughts around what we think about whether the podcast numbers are fudged or not?
Well, I want to figure out a way to actually get a tinfoil hat and put it on, because I think this is another use case of when I can throw it on my head. But I mean, look, these are global numbers or around the US?
These are, according to the article, US numbers.
Okay. So my fear with reading something like this, especially in a year like this, where so many people have moved away from mainstream sources of information like the news and shifted to things like podcasts, how can you devalue the audience numbers in podcasts by simply saying that they're shrinking? So therefore demotivating people from tuning in to get their information. I don't necessarily believe it's accurate. Or option B, the numbers were so inflated originally that, people who were not listening or viewing whatever show it was still getting calculated based on the fact that perhaps they clicked on it by accident. We see these things with Instagram all the time with videos that are viewed. We've discussed it here on the show. Like if you happen to put your phone down for a second and it's on a video, the algorithm recognizes you as actually watching that video. So this could easily be something like that. Again, tinfoil hat, that's the approach I'm going with for my thoughts on this one. I'm very curious to hear what Michelle has to say. By the way, that logo looks pretty familiar.
Yeah, it's interesting. Michelle, what are your thoughts around this? Is the incredible shrinking podcast industry tinfoil hat material, or is this a legit something's going on with the industry here?
I think that the layoffs and the listening numbers are 2 different things, even though I've put story 1 into the Bolt chat and to LinkedIn. But I'll do story 2 in a minute. But I think that during COVID, when everyone was home and everyone was, doing things that they didn't normally do, and a lot of these companies, and we've seen it, haven't we, with Meta and Microsoft and a lot of the others, where they are cutting the numbers of the people that they put in. But really, it's probably a correction to what the numbers that they should have been at. So, they sort of ballooned their workforce for a particular purpose, and now they're getting back to where they probably would have been in terms of staff numbers and those sorts of things if we didn't have COVID. So I'm not 100% sure that the cuts or the layoffs in places like Spotify, for example, are directly related to the fact that not a lot of people are listening to podcasts, if that's what you think about the shrinking podcast numbers story. Now, interestingly, I think a couple of times last year, maybe the last 6 months of last year, we had stories where we were told that the number of people starting podcasts and the number of people listening and the number of hours each person was listening was actually increasing. So it was an interesting thing to do this. This is a little bit like, do you know when something for our American audience, I've read and talked to different people about, they changed the way SATs were scored. So 20 years after you've left school, you got dumber. It's kind of a little bit like that, I think. Yes, they are now saying, well, the metrics were this, now they're going to be that, and that's fine. And it may actually be a more accurate barometer of who's listening to what and how many episodes they're listening to. I mean, I subscribe to a reasonable number of podcasts, maybe 15, and there are probably only 5 that I listen to every week, every episode of them, and the others I kind of pick and choose. Now, I sort of went back and had a bit of a look and thought, okay, so have I listened to 5 episodes of this? All of the ones on my lists, I've listened to at least 5 episodes. And then whether or not I might listen once a fortnight, once a month, depending on what their topics are. And so I think that there's a lot of people like that. What does that mean, I guess, for advertising and for sponsorship? Obviously, that means a big deal, particularly if, just say, for instance, the Joe Rogans of this world suddenly have 40% less. Then I guess the people that spend a lot of money advertising with him would say, hang on, we might need to adjust those figures. What does that mean for people who have podcasts like us or, smaller people? Probably not as much as the top 1% big guys.
All right, I've got a lot of thoughts on this, and I think there's a little fudge going on here. So number one, to your point, advertising. That is what this is about at the end of the day. This is the algo hacking in the audio world. I can say that I've got so many downloads on my podcast, I can charge more now for my advertising. In fact, no one's listening, right? Just because you downloaded me and I was interesting 2 years ago doesn't mean it is now. So I think that the advertising fudgery, I'll call, and I'm coining that term, I think that that's been going on a long time, and Apple's kind of shining a light on that. Apple did not, by the way, for those who don't know, make big fanfare around that they were going to be doing this. They mentioned it, and then out of the blue, they just did it. So it's a lot of places are like corporations are caught with their pants down, where suddenly they don't have the download numbers to command the same ad dollars. So I really do think this is about money, and it's interesting that Apple did what they did and how they approached it. But I also think that if you guys remember back when Gary Vaynerchuk first came on the scene, this is what I thought when I read this article. He was hammering from the stage about Nielsen's ratings and how the marketing world didn't understand that the Nielsen's ratings weren't accurately reflecting consumer preferences. Sure. That if they mail you a survey and you fill out a piece of postcard and mail it back, that's what those ad revenues are based on. How many people are watching television. And this is the same thing. You can say that you have a very engaged audience, but you may not. And in fact, the advertisers need to know, if I put my stuff in front of your audience, what's the likelihood that they're going to engage with you? So I really do think that it gets back to what we've always preached from this show about owning your platform, like meaning you're not beholden to the algorithms, in this case, audio algos. And you really need to have a community, right? This ties right into NFTs and blockchain. At the end of the day, if you don't have an engaged community, it's going to be revealed when Apple cuts your listenership in half.
So my comments about your comments, I revert back to what I mentioned earlier about how, you really can't take whatever they're proclaiming here seriously without the advertisers actually being the ones that are complaining. Yeah. Right now, if the advertisers are still advertising on podcasts because it's this new platform that is reaching this demographic that people want to get involved with, I mean, I always look at things like this at the bottom of the conversion funnel, right? Are sales coming through? You can run a super successful Facebook campaign that has 10 billion comments, 1 million likes, and all these different shares. But if the sales are not happening or you're not getting the conversion that you're expecting out of it, it's useless. So I look at this more at the bottom of the funnel, where if advertisers are the ones that theoretically should be suffering by a lack of downloads or a lack of an audience, then they are the ones that should be complaining here, and they're not. So,
well, Mike, it's only 3 days. This report came out 3 days ago. So
I understand, but this didn't happen. This didn't start 3 days ago, right?
No.
So like clearly advertisers are still advertising on podcasts. Not one is saying, I don't want to do this anymore because I'm not getting the bang for my buck. I'm sure on some shows, but you talk about bigger names like Rogan or some of these other ones that are generating a ton, like especially this year here, there's a ton of political podcasts that are going to be generating a ton of ads. So, again, until they're the ones that are writing articles saying, wait a minute, where the hell is all this audience that they're saying that we have? Like, maybe this is a precursor to that next article, but I still feel like down the funnel is where you got to look.
So if my listenership drops 20%, 30%, 40%, and these are big, again, NPR, Dateline, these are real organizations. If the listenership is down 40% overnight over the last 3 days, you don't think that I, as an advertiser, are going to want a 40% haircut on what you're charging me to get in front of you?
But if the 20% of people that are listening to every single episode are buying a shit ton of products from that advertiser, does that matter?
Correct.
Well, it matters what I pay to that audience. If Rogan loses 40% of his audience all of a sudden, he has to drop ads. That's how it works.
But he doesn't control his ads. Spotify does.
Well, technically, there's a marketplace for that, and Rogan's probably a bad example because he's like the big daddy.
But he did manage his ads at one point,
right? My point is, when people are paying for exposure to audience, that is what advertising is. And if your audience is drying up through some sort of numbers trickery, fudgery, Apple, well, then I'm not going to pay for that.
I mean, anybody that's ever done a TV commercial ad or anything on television, has sort of a front row experience in all this, right? I mean, those numbers are never accurate, especially with demographics and who's watching and all this other stuff. Now, I think the advantage that podcast has over any of these other platforms is the targeted audience that it can do a measuring stick with.
If they're real.
Again, everything is botted. There's a million different.
Right. I kind of feel, though, that audio podcasting, I think we're losing Mike here.
Yeah.
The audio podcast world has no real metrics around it. Not real. It reminds me of influencer marketing, right, Michelle, where you guesstimate what this person's value is because you're trying to figure out if their audience will buy. So,
but that's all advertising.
No, not in the digital world. Blockchain, I know exactly.
Do you?
For transparency purposes,
how many wallets do you got? Because I don't just have one.
But I'm saying that a world where I can see the exact metrics are different from a world where the metrics that they're using are what are they based on again? But we're back to where we were in 1980 with set-top boxes that would track if I was watching MASH.
I get that, but again, there are certain mediums that still works, man. I mean, you drive down the road, you still see billboards.
Yes. I think that the appetite for fuzzy metrics is drying up.
I think that I still think that conversion is more important. Like we've talked about this before, audience versus community versus people who might buy something that costs $9.95 and people that will buy something that costs $1,995. The numbers are different, but at that higher end, at that more engaged end of the spectrum is where conversions happen more easily. And if the advertising is right for that particular audience, then advertisers might not see a drop in the revenue or the flow on that they get from it, even if the numbers drop. Because if people aren't listening anyway, they were never ever buying anyway, were they?
So I want to touch on Mike's conspiracy hat for a second. I think that I want to put my business strategy on, and Mike, I'm thinking this is my conspiracy hat. I'm thinking Apple runs a major podcast distribution platform. Apple is also the one pulling the plug in these numbers. I'm not saying they're doing it on purpose, but it does beg the question of, is this a strategy? Because Spotify, who is a major competitor, is on the ropes.
But there's a bunch of those out there. There's Audible. There's a ton of these different platforms. I mean, there's even platforms out there that stream all of your content on all the platforms. Right. So I think YouTube is going to be doing a podcast stream at some point. We touched on that last year. I mean, this industry is not going away. But, I'll revert to the evolution of what television was. Right. I mean, how many people today actually watch TV versus watching streaming apps? And the streaming apps all have the same commercials. I'm watching the NFL playoffs now, right? The NFL playoffs are playing the exact same commercials at every commercial break. I guarantee you, if I'm watching the television version of this, all different. Why? Because maybe there's much more of a wider range and a local audience that you can target to based around, your ability to connect in locally versus something like a VPN or an internet connection. But the point I'm trying to make here is that no matter what, there are people that are consuming the content, right? And, maybe it's not what Apple's numbers were at some point. Maybe that was a tactic to inflate pricing on advertising. But since the market is moving in this direction anyway, I mean, we've seen a surge. I mean, I'd be curious to know what the difference in percentage increase on podcasts were between now and 10 years ago. I mean, you're talking about thousands of % increase in supply available, right? And with that comes with the demand. So the price has to go down.
So podcast growth, that term is a very loaded term. To your point, Mike, there's just under 2 million active podcasts right now. If you Google this, it'll tell you. But the growth refers to either the listenership, the number of podcasts, or the amount of ad dollars being pumped into it. So this whole concept of like podcasts are growing, that is a very ethereal term that doesn't necessarily mean anything. And I think that this comes down to, as podcasting becomes more popular, I know on Kajabi now they just rolled out a podcast feature. You could just, and YouTube's doing the same as you say. So with these bigger platforms that are not in the podcast game getting in, you're going to have the growth of podcasting's popularity will continue, and they need to get tighter on the numbers because these advertisers will demand it.
So what is the value that a podcast brings to a platform?
Theoretically,
it keeps the user there for at least 45 minutes to an hour, right? So like they are consistently absorbing the content on that platform. That is gold, right? Remember when bounce rates and
websites.
Yeah,
I remember.
So all of these things were relative to, the ability to stay online and on a page. You didn't want to bounce people off the page. It's the same concept.
Right. I don't know. I feel like they're going to get these. It's a real industry now, right? And there's real money there, and they need to get these numbers tighter. And there's no.
But I don't think it's new. I think that we're in the thick of it, and I'm gonna actually go in and use all the tinfoil in my house, and I'm gonna make a hat so I can wear on episodes like this.
You're watching the NFL playoffs right now. What if all of a sudden the National Football League in America announced that all of the fan attendance for the entire past 2 seasons has been cut in half? That none of those stadiums were accurate. They miscounted.
I'd look at the stadiums. I'd look at the games. So you know what I mean? So there's still people out there, you walk through an airport on a Sunday during football season and just count how many football shirts and jerseys and hats you see. Everybody's rocking their team. Regardless if they go to the game, they're still engaged with the sport in some way, shape, or form. It's a multi-billion, if not trillion-dollar industry.
Nobody knows the strategies for winning that sport better than Michelle.
Yes.
All right, I'm taking us up to the next.
No. Wait. So I've just been, while we've been talking, I've been sort of doing some research. I've been going on the Googles, as they say. So I don't have 10 years ago, Mike, but 2019, 274.8 million people listen to podcasts. And by 2024, they're predicting 500 million.
So that doesn't sound like lower to me.
No, that isn't lower. And on average, 64% of Americans listen to 8 podcasts a week on average. 8.
See, there you go. So there's my feed's going to cut again because I'm bringing the point up again. Look, it proves my point, right? Just now, today, in this moment where we are in this country, podcasts are becoming a primary source of absorbing information. It could be any information. Why do crickets make noise at night? There's a show out there about that for some reason, right? I mean, Carlin had a joke a long time ago. They made magazines about everything. Walking had a magazine, a magazine about walking. So now is the same concept about podcasts, but you know what? It's going to pique somebody's interest and they're going to listen.
the long tail of the internet, no argument. There's a bunch of weirdos out there who like their thing. Got it. But paying and having that number cut in half, and now I'm like, whoa, wait a minute. I just have half as many people as I thought listening to what I was listening,
it might be a negotiation tool that advertisers might play, but again, if the conversion is still happening, they're not going to blink.
I think the scourge of this show as a podcast is that we're so early on this, and it's a little bit of a back pat here, but like it's been 3 days in. We'll check back on this in a couple of weeks. I guarantee you there's going to be, because if I'm Coca-Cola or Red Bull, I'm going to be like, what am I paying for?
A negotiation tool.
Mike, is your wife from Chile?
Colombia,
that's right. Sorry. Well, Colombia isn't on the list, but 84% growth in Chile for podcasts in the last 5 years.
Chileans love their podcast.
And look, a lot of that has to do with the availability of devices. Yes.
Yeah, smartphones.
Exactly.
I find it hard to believe that 8 podcasts a week on average in America. I don't know anyone listening to Mike. You listen to 8 podcasts?
8 different ones or 8 shows like throughout the course of the week?
It just said 8 podcasts. It didn't.
Okay, episodes I could believe. Yes.
I would listen to at least 8. I mean, when I work out, when I'm, making breakfast in the morning, I'll throw something on. Am I consistent with some? Yeah. Am I inconsistent with others? Sure. But again, similar to what Michelle said, I mean, if it's a topic of interest, I don't care what it is, I'll listen to it. If it's a alternative viewpoint, I'll listen to it and get angry and then bring up different talking points and thoughts on how I can combat it later on.
All right. I want to take us into
You know what? I've got one more thing to say. I think though that the people are more used to now that we've got smartphones of being connected for greater periods of time. See, in the old days, you used to go to the gym and you went to the gym, and when you're at the gym, they might have the TV on and you might watch that. But that's kind of it. You didn't have wireless headphones. You weren't able to be connected. So what happens now is that when people are on the train or the bus going to work, or they're at the gym, or they're driving in their cars with, Apple CarPlay and Android Play and all of that stuff, they can listen to stuff now. They're not like, we used to have 3 channels on the radio, and it was either talkback, classics or punk rock, and that was it. They were your choices. Now you've got a plethora of things you can listen to. And when there's 3 songs in a row that I don't like, I go, I'm going to put a podcast on because, and so I think that makes a big difference now as well. And that's probably why you've got upwards of 7 or 8 episodes a week where people are listening for podcasts.
So 10 years ago, when I launched a product here in Miami, I was driving across the country launching it, right? I was going to all these various shows and cities and stores, and I was like on the ground, like all over the place. And people used to ask me, like, how do you drive from Miami to Dallas in one shot? Right. And I used to tell them flat out, like, this is way before podcasts, but I used to download stand-up comedy shows. Right. Because you get so immersed into the conversation, you blink and 2 hours are gone. Yeah. Right. So like, it's a super easy way to pass the time. The bus, the train, everything you just mentioned. This is why I don't believe that this article is 100% accurate and that there's a bigger conspiracy behind it.
For those non-Americans, Miami to Dallas is 20 hours, according to Google, Mike.
Yes, I made it in 18.
All right, wow. So I'm taking us into the next conspiracy theory. Grab your tinfoil hat, Mike. You need this for this one. Actually, hold on a second. Okay. Backwards. YouTube accused of throttling CPU performance for users with ad block. This is coming off of PCGamer.com. This is saying there's an article now that YouTube is being accused of slowing down users' PCs if you have ad block installed. Ad block users have reported widespread performance issues only when they have the extension enabled while they're on YouTube. Reddit has had active conversations saying that ad block enabled on YouTube causes slow load times, and it's been measured at 70% higher CPU usage. So there's no argument that there is slowness if you have ad block and you're on YouTube. YouTube is blaming it on ad block. So I guess, Mike, we'll start with you because you got all the info.
You've both got your tinfoil hats on tonight, but I need one too because we should have made hats to wear tonight. Because we got to
have a tinfoil hat episode, guys. We have to have that.
I'm going to make one. I kid you not. But like, look,
I need them the Santa Claus hats.
I don't think that this is a conspiracy. I mean, they're literally saying it, right? Like, this is what's happening.
Well, now, YouTube can. Though?
100% it's on purpose. 100% it's on purpose. Now,
They're
why would
saying
they?
it's not. They're saying YouTube is saying it's Adblock's fault.
Of course they are. What are they going to admit it? They're going to admit the fact that they can manipulate people's download speeds on their end. Of course they can, but they don't want people to know that. So I 100% believe this story. I do not believe YouTube. And again, YouTube, an extension of Google. You think I'm going to give them any credibility?
Where's the meme of Mark Zuckerberg looking in the bedroom window?
Yeah.
I agree. I think it's bloody hilarious that they think that we would think that, oh, poor YouTube, they're being blamed for something they didn't do. Yeah, I agree. I think that if they're not directly causing it, they're certainly not doing anything about helping the problem be solved.
So the two things I will add, number one, it's infuriating, right? Because whose phone is it or mobile device? It's theoretically yours. But more importantly, people forget you can no longer force the consumer in anything. And people forget that folks talk. So the minute I'm slowness and Mike's got slowness and Michelle, next thing you know, like Reddit, this is the same problem in the political system. You can't hide anything. And these companies that try, whether Google or YouTube, in this case, it's just Google, is or is on not doing it on purpose, will come out. I guarantee it'll come out. Because this smells like the Sports Illustrated issue from a couple of weeks back where they were using AI to write articles. And then at first they were like, yeah, we'll just kind of pretend it didn't happen. You can't hide. And I feel like YouTube, yeah, Mike, to your point, they're one of those types of companies you really got to keep a closer eye on, unfortunately.
Well, I mean, again, they're not one to say, you know what, guys, you caught me. My bad. We'll do something to make it right. Right. Like, I don't think anybody in the world would think that YouTube would do that, or Google for that matter. Right. So their response to this is just proof that this is an accurate story.
Right. So I come. Go ahead.
I was going to say it's their response is a bit like, look, we've done some dodgy shit before, but not this one.
But not this time. We promise. We promise.
So I was going there, Michelle. This reminds me of finance. Like I come out of the Wall Street world where, firms like JP Morgan and Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, they get caught all the time doing things they shouldn't be doing. Some adjunct division was involved in some other company that was doing child trafficking, crazy stuff. And
what about don't buy Bitcoin while they were stockpiling Bitcoin? What about that?
The playbook out of that world, and it's probably the same in the tech space. I never worked in tech specifically, but is as long as it's not on the headline when the truth comes out, that's okay. Like, yeah, sorry, we made a mistake. We didn't realize. Like, they'll play the dumb card for a bit, and then they're going to some whistleblower steps forward. There's a fine, but it doesn't make the papers. That's the playbook out of the finance world. So I'm expecting something like that in the YouTube thing. Yeah, YouTube's got the ability to know and test and see and fix if they have to, if there's a problem. So yeah.
there's a strategy behind this. And I know a guy that was very much involved in politics, like secretary cabinet level stuff. And he told me a story once. He's like, look, when a new president comes into the office, he looks into the drawer on his desk and there's 3 envelopes. And, he says, if there's ever a problem, open the first envelope. So the president goes through his term, issue arises, something going on with the economy, all hell's breaking loose. He remembers the conversation, goes in and opens the first envelope. In the first envelope, it said, blame the previous administration. So they get out in front, they blame the previous administration, everything gets swept under the rug. Another problem happens several months later. Remembers the envelope again, comes in and he's like, he opens up the envelope, and in the envelope it said, blame someone else. Didn't say the previous administration, just said blame someone else for the problem. So that's what they did. It boiled over. Everything was fine. The third problem arises. He remembers the envelope again and how it worked out so well last time. He opens up the envelope and it says, if you're reading this, make 3 envelopes. So
great.
There's strategy to all of this, right? There's strategy. Even if you did it, if you didn't do it, there's a way to get you out of the crosshairs. And unfortunately, again, with everything that we have at our disposal for information and access to different storylines and things, it's very difficult to try to skate by not being accurate and then try to backtrack it later on. Now, news media does this all the time, right? They'll come out with some headline, they'll be way in front of it, even if it's not accurate, and then just sort of be kind of nonchalant and backtracking about it. People lose confidence in that. And again, bringing this all back to story number one, that's why they're looking for alternative forms of media and information and ways to interact with the rest of the world outside.
So interesting on that point, Mike. Who owns YouTube, right? It's Google. Who's the big competitor? Hulu?
Well, Rumble is blowing up.
Right, but it's not quite got the scale that YouTube has.
It definitely does not. And it doesn't have the algorithm behind it like YouTube does with Google, right? So there's benefits to that. I think that, there will be an alternative to everything. And we just are blessed that we live in a place that, that's possible. There's going to be forces that try to shut it down like they did with Rumble back in 2020. A lot of people forget this. AWS pulled their server. So they actually had to go out and redo the entire configuration on the back end. But I think that no matter what you look at, the access to keep people buried underwater with information is just not available anymore. And some of these older, bigger companies can't get out of their own way with that kind of stuff. They think that they control the narrative and that they can kind of spin everything to blame it on ad blocker.
Right. I agree. I totally agree with you that you can hide for only so long. My exact point.
I think one of the important things from this article too is that people who are paying for YouTube Premium, which in theory, you're paying for YouTube Premium so you don't have to watch or listen to the ads and have your shows interrupted halfway through, are still experiencing slowness if they've got an ad blocker for something else. So that to me says that it's, it could be that YouTube, whatever it is that they're sending, is doing it to everyone regardless.
Right.
I don't know technically, Mike, how that works, but.
Well, they control the feed, right? They control the account, they control the feed. But you see, what they don't understand or what they fail to realize is that there are people out there that absorb content like this virtually 24/7. And while absorbing that content, they actually have meters and metrics next to them to see any glitch in their feed or any glitch in their algorithm. And what do? They take that information and they bring it to places like Reddit that allow people to discuss this and say, hey, I dealt with that same issue too. What's going on here? And that's how everything snowballs. I mean, Q in GameStop. That's exactly what happened with that. People recognized flaws in the system, and all of a sudden it became a topic that the people who typically get away with those types of things couldn't backtrack from.
That's interesting, Mike. Yeah, the GameStop is a really good comparison. I kind of agree with you. I don't know. I just feel like information wants to be free, and people, this type of stuff, you can't bank on it being the way it used to be.
Well, Spanner brings up a good point here. Maybe ad blocker will come out with a way to counter their ability to slow that down, right? Maybe mask or be a stealth mode ad blocker software that's in place. Now, this is the tech evolution of, one solution versus one problem back and forth, right? I mean, we see this in nature all the time. If a creature starts eating another creature, that creature will evolve to have some sort of a defense mechanism against that, right? This is no different. I hope that's the case. But again, we live in this weird world where, all of a sudden ad blocker might be bought by Google.
Right. Yeah. Well, to my point.
And the other thing too, another comment was that, if people weren't finding these things so damn annoying, then you wouldn't need to have ad blocker software on your computer. And then there wouldn't be a need for this in the way it is. It's because it's, and we've talked about this on a number of other episodes before about these sorts of invasive techniques are not the way in which you build a community of the people who, use or buy your services or products.
But you're not building a community on purpose. They just want you, there's a difference between building a community and what they're doing. They're not trying to build a community is my point. And actually to that point, Michelle, my kids are same as your age. They're teenagers. They are not susceptible to this in any way, shape, or form. They cannot understand why I would ever have an ad on their gaming, on their apps. There is no advertising at all ever. They share with each other and they make sure that they've got the latest edge of whatever. So they never see ads.
Yeah.
And they're frankly surprised that I'm not more diligent about it. And it's because it's a generational thing. But these kids nowadays, they're not going for that.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I remember a time when ads didn't exist on those videos. And I also remember a time when they first appeared and people got pissed.
Yeah.
Even the in-game purchases, right? We've talked about this in the gaming world. This fires that community up. They do not want to have to pay if they don't have to, and they don't want to be subjected to have their attention taken. Michelle, you raise a good point there. This is a generational psychology has to be accounted for in advertising.
Yeah. Right. I mean, and, like winding through commercials and stuff like that on television. Like, I think we've probably mentioned, I'm sure we've mentioned it before, but we've all experienced it. Like when you were watching your weekly sitcom when Friends or, Seinfeld or whatever was on, and the ads gave you the opportunity to go to the bathroom and boil the kettle to make a cup of tea.
Yeah.
So now what do? You've got to actually pause it, and go off. It's like, oh, right in the middle of this, I have to pause it. Whereas it was kind of a bit, like, and you'd run back in and dive over the back of the sofa and sit on it just as it resumed,
Or you record it. Or you recorded it
right.
and like you watch it later. But what do you do when you watch the recording? You fast forward through the commercials.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Maybe TiVo killed ads.
What Mike's not old enough to know before recording was a thing.
But this was the whole Gary Vaynerchuk's argument, was that if something were to happen, you're just going to fast forward. Your remote falls off the bed. You're still going to go to your phone.
Yeah.
So it doesn't forced advertising is over. Has been for a while.
Yes.
Well, the irony to that is that you go to your phone just to watch other ads.
Right. All right, so I'm going to wrap it with that. We're going to keep a short episode this week. We are back every week, Wednesday, 4 p.m. Eastern time. This is the digital media revolution. We try to earmark what's happening in the digital media space, how you can use it. We tend to revolve around the blockchain-oriented topics as well, which I'm sure we'll be returning to next week. I do think, to my two co-hosts, we should think about a tinfoil hat episode. I'm dead serious. Some conspiracy thing that we think ties in. We'll talk about that off
Only tinfoil hats.
You're right.
I'm gonna make one. I'm telling you. I feel like I'm gonna put it in practice a lot this year. So I might as well have it.
We're out over LinkedIn, YouTube, and Bolt. We want to thank the Bolt Nation for listening. Spanner and the gang. We know that you're there. We appreciate you guys every week.
Linda Ray's on today as well. So Linda's long time listener.
Yeah. So our podcast numbers have been cut in half from like 5 to 2. Teasing. But the truth of the matter is we are very grateful for everyone that listens, and we thank you guys for coming in with questions. We'll be back next week, and that's all I got. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Have a good one.
Bye.